No one breathes wrong in Daria Russo's house without consequences. Known as the ruthless, untouchable architect of the East Coast Syndicate, his temper is legendary, his empathy non-existent. So, when the billionaire boss returned to his fortress-like estate at 3 a.m., his hand still bearing the violent evidence of a turf war, he expected absolute silence. Instead, a faint, ragged cough echoed from the servants' quarters. Kicking open the heavy oak door of the laundry wing, Daria didn't find an assassin or a spy. He found his newest maid, trembling and asleep on the cold marble floor, tightly clutching a sick infant to her chest. His security detail immediately drew their weapons, bracing for an execution. But what Daria did next shattered every rule of the underworld and changed their lives forever. The winter winds whipping off the Long Island Sound were merciless, rattling the bulletproof glass of the Russo estate. For Delwyn Hughes, the sprawling 30-room mansion was both a sanctuary and a prison. At 24, Delwyn was entirely invisible, a ghost in a black and white uniform, whose only purpose was to ensure the mahogany gleamed and the Italian marble floors were spotless before the master of the house awoke. Delwyn had not chosen this life out of ambition. She had chosen it out of pure, suffocating desperation. Just 3 weeks prior, she had been evicted from a crumbling, heatless apartment in Queens. Her bank account was overdrawn, and the medical bills from Mount Sinai Hospital were piling up in a terrifying mountain of debt. But none of that mattered as much as the tiny, fragile life entirely dependent on her. Leo. Leo was only 10 months old, a quiet baby with striking, soulful dark eyes that seemed too old for his little face. He had been born prematurely, his lungs weak, his immune system compromised. Daycare was an impossibility. Not only was it thousands of dollars she didn't have, but leaving him in a room full of other children was a death sentence for his fragile respiratory system. When Delwyn secured the position as a live-out maid for Daria Russo, a man whispered about in the terrified, hushed tones usually reserved for natural disasters. She knew the rules. No guests, no personal phone calls, complete discretion, absolute silence. Mrs. Gable, the iron-spined housekeeper who ran the estate with militant precision, had made it perfectly clear. Mr. Russo does not tolerate distractions. You are to be unseen and unheard. For the first 2 weeks, Delwyn managed a precarious balancing act. She left Leo with an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, paying her under the table with the meager tips she'd saved from her previous diner job. But yesterday, Mrs. Higgins had suffered a fall, breaking her hip. With zero support system, no family to call, and the threat of immediate termination if she missed a single shift, Delwyn made a terrified, reckless decision. She smuggled Leo into the Russo estate. It wasn't as impossible as it sounded, provided one had the quiet desperation of a mother. The estate was massive, a labyrinth of guest wings, commercial-grade kitchens, and extensive subterranean laundry facilities that the boss never visited. Delwyn had carried Leo onto the grounds in an oversized canvas laundry tote, bypassing the heavy security detail at the front gates by entering through the delivery bay with the morning linen service. All day, she had kept him hidden in a deep, unused storage closet off the main utility room. She lined a plastic laundry bin with plush, stolen Ralph Lauren towels to make a makeshift crib. Every hour, she would sneak away from dusting the grand library or polishing Daria's collection of vintage Patek Philippe watches to check on him, feed him, and pray he wouldn't cry. But as the evening descended, disaster struck. Leo spiked a fever. It started as a warm flush on his cheeks and rapidly escalated into a burning heat that radiated through his tiny body. His breathing grew shallow and raspy. Delwyn was trapped. Her shift was supposed to end at 9 p.m., but a massive gala at the Cipriani in Manhattan had kept the household staff on standby. Mrs. Gable had ordered a mandatory deep clean of the West Wing in preparation for some associates arriving the next day. By 2 a.m., the other staff had finally been dismissed, but Delwyn had stayed behind. She couldn't take a feverish baby out into the freezing snowstorm currently hammering New York. She had no car, and the 2-mile walk to the nearest train station would kill him. Exhausted to her very bones, her hands blistered from bleach and hot water, Delwyn retreated to the utility room. She took Leo from his makeshift bin, cradling his burning body against her chest. She stripped off her uniform cardigan, wrapping it around him in a desperate attempt to regulate his temperature. She sat on the cold, hard floor of the utility room, leaning against the humming warmth of a massive industrial dryer. The rhythmic hum was the only lullaby she could offer. "Shh, baby, I know," she whispered into the dark, her tears falling into his dark curls. "I know it hurts. Mummy's here. I've got you." She rocked him, singing a soft, broken melody. The physical toll of scrubbing floors for 16 hours, combined with the crushing anxiety of her reality, finally overtook her. Despite her terror of being caught, Delwyn's eyes drifted shut. She slumped against the metal machine, pulling the baby closer, burying her face in his warm neck, and surrendered to the dark. She had no idea that a convoy of black Maybachs had just breached the front gates. Dario Russo was a man built of sharp edges and cold steel. At 32, he controlled a shipping and logistics empire that served as an ironclad front for the most lucrative illicit syndicate on the eastern seaboard. He was a man who traded in power, fear, and leverage. Tonight had been a spectacular failure of diplomacy. The sit-down at the Cipriani with the Russian Bratva had deteriorated into a bloodbath. Daria had barely escaped an orchestrated hit, losing 2 of his best men in the crossfire in the private dining room. His tailored Brioni suit was ruined, splattered with the blood of a man who had tried to put a bullet in his skull just 2 hours prior. Stepping out of the armored Maybach, Daria's expression was carved from granite. His right-hand man, Silvio, walked closely behind him, his hand hovering over the concealed weapon in his jacket. The storm whipped snow around them, but Daria barely felt the cold. The adrenaline was still burning in his veins, toxic and demanding a release. "Double the perimeter guard," Daria ordered, his voice a low, dangerous gravel that cut through the howling wind. "No one enters or leaves. If a shadow moves without clearance, shoot it." "Understood, boss," Silvio replied grimly. Daria pushed open the heavy front doors of the estate. The mansion was tomb-silent, exactly how he demanded it to be. He hated the presence of staff. He hated the reminder that people were in his sanctuary. He unholstered his Sig Sauer, placing it heavily on the silver tray in the foyer, alongside his blood-stained Rolex. He needed a drink. He needed to wash the smell of copper and cordite from his skin. He bypassed the grand staircase, heading toward the kitchen to pour a glass of Macallan 25. The adrenaline crash was setting in, making his senses hyper-acute. As he poured the amber liquid, he paused. A sound. It was faint, barely registering over the hum of the refrigerator. It was a wet, raspy sound, followed by a soft, muffled whimper. Daria's instincts, honed by years of surviving assassination attempts, flared instantly. He didn't reach for his gun in the foyer. He slid the spare combat knife from his ankle sheath. He moved with the silent, predatory grace of a man half his size, tracking the noise. Silvio, noticing the shift in his boss's demeanor, materialized at the kitchen doorway, weapon drawn, his eyes scanning for a threat. Daria held up 2 fingers, pointing toward the service corridor. the laundry wing. They moved down the dimly lit hallway. The sound grew slightly louder. A cough. A human, ragged cough. Daria positioned himself beside the heavy utility room door. With a swift, brutal kick, he sent the door flying open, crashing against the wall with a deafening bang. Silvio swept into the room, sweeping the corners with the tactical light of his pistol. "Clear right," Silvio barked. Daria stepped into the room, his knife gripped tightly. But the scene before him made him freeze. There was no hitman waiting in the shadows. There was no brat-for-rat sent to finish the job. Instead, curled into a tight ball on the freezing marble floor next to the industrial dryer, was a young woman in the black skirt and white blouse of his domestic staff. She was fast asleep, her face pale and exhausted, with dark purple shadows bruised under her eyes, and clutched desperately to her chest, wrapped in a cheap, worn cardigan, was a baby. The violent crash of the door had startled the infant. The baby let out a sharp, pitiful cry, thrashing weakly against the woman. Delwyn gasped, jolting awake in a panic. Her eyes flew open, wide and blown with sheer terror, as she found herself staring down the barrel of an unsuppressed Glock, held by a heavily scarred man, and standing right beside him was Dario Russo himself, a bloody knife in his hand. For a second, the air in the room vanished. "Please!" Delwyn choked out, instinctively curling her body over the baby to shield him, her voice cracking with terror. "Please don't. Please, I'm sorry." Silvio didn't lower his weapon. He looked at Daria, waiting for the order. Trespassing in the Russo estate, bringing an unknown individual, even a child, into the secure zone, was an offense punishable by death. In their world, a baby could easily be a Trojan horse for a bomb. "Boss?" Silvio asked, his tone flat. "Do I secure them?" Daria stared at the woman on the floor. He recognized her vaguely. She was the new hire Mrs. Gable had brought on. He noted the way she was shivering, the way she offered her own back to a potential bullet to protect the child. He looked at the baby, who was coughing violently now, a sickening, wet rattle filling the room. The rage that had been boiling in Daria's blood suddenly evaporated, replaced by an eerie, absolute stillness. "Put the gun down, Silvio," Daria said softly. Silvio hesitated. "Dom, the protocols," I said. Daria turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto his underboss with lethal intent. "Put the gun away." Silvio holstered his weapon, taking a step back. Daria slowly crouched down, ignoring the blood on his suit. He looked at Delwyn, who was trembling so violently her teeth were chattering. "You brought a child into my home," Daria said, his voice terrifyingly calm, completely devoid of emotion. It wasn't a question. I had no choice," Delwyn sobbed, tears spilling down her cheeks. "My sitter, she went to the hospital. He has a fever. He's sick. I couldn't leave him in the snow. I didn't mean to fall asleep. I was going to leave through the back. Please, Mr. Russo, fire me. Do whatever you want to me. Just let me take him to a clinic." Daria reached out a hand. Delwyn flinched violently, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for a strike. But the strike never came. Instead, Daria's large, calloused hand gently brushed the baby's forehead. His skin was burning. It was dangerously hot. "He's burning up," Daria stated flatly. He looked at Delwyn's terrified face. "How long has he been like this?" "Since this afternoon," Delwyn whispered. Daria stood up abruptly. He didn't yell. He didn't order her dragged out. He looked at Silvio. "Call Kessler. Tell him to get to the estate in 10 minutes with a full pediatric trauma kit. If he's not here in 10, I'll blow up his clinic." Silvio's eyes widened. Dr. Aris Kessler was the syndicate's private trauma surgeon, a man who extracted bullets and stitched up knife wounds, not a pediatrician. But one didn't question Daria Russo. "Yes, boss." Silvio turned and sprinted down the hall. Daria looked back down at Delwyn. "Get up!" Delwyn scrambled to her feet, clutching the crying baby. Her legs felt like jelly. "Follow me," Daria commanded, turning on his heel and walking out of the utility room. Delwyn had no choice but to follow the Mafia boss deeper into the terrifying fortress. Daria led Delwyn up the grand staircase, bypassing the servant quarters entirely, and guided her into one of the sprawling, opulent guest suites in the East Wing. The room was massive, dominated by a king-sized bed draped in Egyptian cotton and a roaring fireplace that had been lit by the evening staff. "Put him on the bed," Daria ordered, stripping off his ruined, blood-stained suit jacket and throwing it over a velvet armchair. Delwyn hesitated, looking at the pristine white duvet, and then down at her crying, sweating baby. He'll ruin the sheets. I own a shipping company, Delwyn. I can import more sheets. Put the damn baby on the bed, Daria snapped, his patience wearing thin, though not with her. It was the helplessness of the situation that grated on him. Delwyn gently laid Leo down. The baby was struggling for air, his little chest heaving. Delwyn stripped away the makeshift swaddle, leaving him in just his onesie to try and cool him down. Daria walked over to the ensuite bathroom, returning a moment later with a cool, damp washcloth. He didn't hand it to Delwyn. To her absolute shock, the ruthless crime lord sat on the edge of the bed and gently began to dab the baby's burning forehead and neck. His movements were surprisingly tender for a man whose knuckles were currently bruised from breaking a man's jaw. "What is his name?" Daria asked, his dark eyes focused entirely on the child. "Leo," Delwyn whispered, standing awkwardly by the foot of the bed, entirely unsure if she was dreaming or entering a nightmare. "Where is the father?" The question made Delwyn stiffen. She looked away, her hands wringing her apron. He passed away before Leo was born." Daria's hands paused. He looked up at her, really looking at her for the first time. He saw the frayed edges of her uniform, the cheap scuff marks on her orthopedic shoes, the sheer, unadulterated terror and love swimming in her eyes. It was a look he knew well. It was the look of someone surviving purely on adrenaline and duty. Suddenly, Leo let out a piercing wail, thrashing his arms. As he did, the neckline of his onesie pulled down, revealing the skin over his collarbone. Daria froze. The damp cloth slipped from his fingers, falling onto the mattress. He stared at the baby's chest. Right below the collarbone, hanging on a cheap piece of twine that Delwyn had clearly used to replace a broken chain, was a heavy, tarnished silver locket. It was deeply engraved with the image of St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. But it wasn't just any generic religious medal. It had a very distinct, jagged scratch across the saint's face, a scratch made by a stray bullet in Palermo 5 years ago. Daria's breathing stopped. The room suddenly felt completely devoid of oxygen. His mind violently rejected what his eyes were seeing, but the evidence was irrefutable. He slowly, numbly reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he touched the cold silver. He flipped it over. Engraved on the back in crude, jagged lettering were 3 initials, M.A.R., Matteo Antonio Russo, Daria's younger brother, the brother who had been brutally assassinated in a car bombing in Miami 18 months ago. Daria stood up so fast he knocked over a crystal glass on the bedside table, shattering it into 100 pieces. Delwyn jumped, letting out a small scream, instinctively throwing herself over the baby again. "Where did you get this?" Daria roared, the calm completely shattering, replaced by a terrifying, predatory intensity. He grabbed Delwyn by the arms, pulling her up. He didn't hurt her, but his grip was like a vice. "Where the hell did you get this medal?" "Please," Delwyn sobbed, struggling against him. "It's his. It was his father's." "His father is dead," Daria yelled, the grief and rage of a year and a half erupting in his chest. "I know," Delwyn cried out, her own dam breaking. "He was murdered. They blew up his car." Daria let go of her as if she burned him. He stumbled back, his chest heaving, his eyes darting between Delwyn and the baby on the bed. "Matteo," Daria whispered, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked at the baby again. The dark, soulful eyes, the shape of the jaw. God, how had he not seen it instantly? The kid looked exactly like Matteo did in his baby pictures. "How?" Daria demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low hiss. "Matteo's girlfriend, Sophia. She was killed in the crossfire at the hospital. They said she died on the table. They said the unborn baby died with her." Delwyn backed away, her hands covering her mouth, realizing exactly who she was standing in front of. She had known the father's last name was Russo. She had taken this job specifically to hide in plain sight, believing the safest place from the people hunting Matteo's bloodline was deep within the territory of his estranged, terrifying older brother. I was the scrub nurse in the ER that night in Miami," Delwyn confessed, her voice shaking violently. Sophia didn't die immediately. They kept her alive on machines just long enough to perform an emergency C-section. But the men who shot her, they breached the hospital. They were going floor to floor, executing witnesses. They were looking for the baby to end the bloodline. Daria stared at her, paralyzed by the weight of her words. "The head surgeon was shot," Delwyn continued, tears streaming freely now. "I hid in the supply closet with the baby. Sophia made me promise, before she lost consciousness. She shoved that medal into my hand. She told me to take him. She told me to hide him. She said the cartel would kill him to punish you." Delwyn looked down at the floor, overwhelmed by the memory of the blood, the gunfire, the terror. "I forged the birth certificate. I put myself down as the mother. I ran to New York. I've been running ever since." Daria stood perfectly still. The silence in the room was deafening, save for the labored breathing of his nephew. His blood. The only piece of his brother left in the world. For 18 months, Daria had turned the criminal underworld into a graveyard seeking revenge for his brother. He had tortured, he had killed, he had burned empires to the ground, all while believing he was entirely alone in the world. And here, sleeping on the floor of his laundry room, brought in by a desperate, terrified 24-year-old nurse who had sacrificed her entire life to protect a child that wasn't hers, was his family. The heavy oak doors to the bedroom burst open. Dr. Kessler rushed in, carrying a massive black medical bag, followed closely by Silvio. "Dom, I'm here. What's the emergency?" Kessler asked, out of breath, his eyes scanning the room, landing in confusion on the maid and the infant. Daria didn't look at the doctor. His eyes remained locked on Delwyn. The hardened, ruthless Mafia boss, a man who hadn't shed a tear since he was a child, felt his vision blur. "Fix him," Daria ordered Kessler, his voice raw and thick with an emotion Silvio had never heard before. "Whatever it takes. You save him." Daria stepped closer to Delwyn. She flinched, but he didn't grab her. Instead, to the absolute shock of Silvio and the doctor, the Don of the East Coast Syndicate dropped to his knees right in front of the young maid. "You saved him," Daria whispered, looking up at her, the mask of the ruthless monster completely stripped away. "You gave up everything to save my brother's son." Delwyn looked down at the terrifying man kneeling before her, realizing the gravity of what she had just unearthed. Nobody, Daria vowed, his voice hardening into cold, unbreakable steel. Nobody will ever make you hide on a floor again. You are under my protection now, both of you. The opulent guest suite, usually reserved for syndicate bosses and corrupt politicians, had been transformed into a makeshift trauma bay in less than 20 minutes. Dr. Aris Kessler moved with the practiced, ruthless efficiency of a man used to pulling hollow-point bullets out of mobsters on kitchen tables. But tonight, his hands were remarkably gentle as he inserted a tiny, butterfly IV needle into the back of the 10-month-old's hand. Daria stood perfectly still by the massive stone fireplace, a dark, brooding monolith. He had finally stripped off his blood-soaked Brioni shirt, leaving him in a plain black undershirt that did nothing to hide the heavy musculature and the dark ink of syndicate tattoos sprawling across his arms. His gaze never left the bed. His temperature is 104.2, Kessler muttered, hanging a bag of fluids and a heavy dose of broad-spectrum antibiotics from a custom iron floor lamp. It's a severe lower respiratory infection, borderline pneumonia. If you had waited until morning to find them, Dom, the fever would have caused permanent neurological damage, or worse. Delwyn let out a choked sob from the corner of the room. She was sitting on a velvet ottoman, her knees pulled to her chest, trembling violently. The adrenaline that had kept her running for 18 months was crashing, leaving her hollowed out and fragile. Daria's jaw tightened, the thought of losing the only piece of Matteo he had left, because his own housekeeper had forced Delwyn into hiding in a freezing utility room, ignited a terrifying cold fury in his chest. "Will he stabilize?" Daria asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that demanded a positive answer. "The Rossifin should bring the fever down within the hour," Kessler replied, packing away his stethoscope. "He needs round-the-clock monitoring. I'll have equipment couriered over from Lenox Hill Hospital through our private channels. Pediatric monitors, an oxygen tent, the works." "Do it," Daria ordered. "Silvio." Silvio, who had been standing guard at the heavy oak doors, stepped forward. "Boss." "Find Mrs. Gable." Daria's voice was devoid of all warmth, a lethal flatline. "Sever her employment. Give her 10 minutes to pack her bags and have her escorted off the property. If she ever speaks a word of what she saw tonight, I will have her buried under the new shipping terminal in Brooklyn." Silvio nodded grimly. "Consider it done." As Silvio exited, Daria finally turned his attention fully to Delwyn. She looked impossibly small in the grand, cavernous room. Her cheap maid's uniform was stained with bleach, sweat, and floor wax. She was staring at Leo's sleeping form with a desperation that made Daria's chest ache in a way he hadn't experienced since he was a child. He walked over to her. Delwyn instinctively flinched, pressing herself deeper into the corner. Despite him kneeling before her earlier, he was still Daria Russo, the man the FBI called the Architect of the East, a man whose reputation for violence was legendary from Hell's Kitchen to Palermo. "You need to eat," Daria said softly, pulling up a heavy mahogany chair and sitting opposite her. "And you need to sleep." "I can't," Delwyn whispered, her voice raw. "I have to watch his breathing. If the IV infiltrates, he could go into sepsis. I'm a nurse. I know how fast it happens." "You were a nurse," Daria corrected gently. "At Jackson Memorial Hospital in Miami, if my timeline is correct. The night of the shooting, the cartel hit squad wiped the security footage. My men spent millions trying to track down what happened to Sophia and the baby. The official coroner's report stated they both died in the trauma bay." Delwyn swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously. The cartel paid the medical examiner off. I saw the men in suits hand him a briefcase. They wanted you to believe the bloodline was severed so you would stop hunting at them. They didn't know I had slipped out through the biohazard disposal bay with him. Daria leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his dark eyes studying her face. He saw the profound exhaustion, the terror, and beneath it all, an unbreakable core of titanium. You abandoned your career, your family, your entire identity, Daria stated, awe bleeding into his tone, for a child that wasn't yours. He was innocent, Delwyn said fiercely, a sudden spark of defiance lighting up her exhausted eyes. He was just a baby. He didn't ask to be born into a war. The words struck Daria like a physical blow. He looked away, his jaw clenching. She was right. The blood on his hands, the empire he had built. It was a world of monsters, and this beautiful, terrified girl had thrown herself to the wolves to shield an innocent soul from it. "Silvio!" Daria barked, the sudden volume making Delwyn jump. His underboss reappeared in the doorway instantly. "Get a security detail on this wing. Nobody enters except Kessler and myself," Daria ordered. He then turned back to Delwyn. "You will sleep in the adjoining suite. The doors remain open. You will hear him if he cries. But if you don't sleep, you will collapse, and you are no good to him dead." It wasn't a request. It was a command from a king in his castle. Delwyn looked at the massive plush bed in the connecting room, then at Leo, whose chest was finally rising and falling with easier, deeper breaths. The monitors beeped steadily. "Okay," she whispered, the fight completely draining out of her. As she stood on shaky legs, Daria stood as well. Without thinking, he reached out and steadied her by the elbow. His hand was massive, his skin radiating heat. Delwyn gasped softly at the contact, looking up into his dark, intense eyes. For a split second, the air between them crackled with an undeniable heavy charge, a collision of two entirely different worlds. "You are safe here, Delwyn," Daria murmured, his thumb brushing lightly against her arm. "No one will ever hunt you again. I swear it on my life." A week passed, and the brutal winter storm outside the Russo estate finally broke, leaving behind a pristine, deceptive blanket of white snow over the sprawling Long Island compound. Inside, the dynamic of the house had violently shifted. Delwyn was no longer a ghost in a black and white uniform. Under Daria's strict orders, she had been moved into the master guest wing permanently. Her cheap, threadbare clothes had been disposed of, replaced by wardrobes delivered by terrified personal shoppers from Saks Fifth Avenue and Bergdorf Goodman. She wore cashmere sweaters and soft silk loungewear. Yet she felt more trapped than ever. It was a beautiful, suffocating, velvet prison. Leo's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. The heavy antibiotics and round-the-clock care from Dr. Kessler had eradicated the pneumonia. The 10-month-old was now crawling across the priceless Persian rugs of Daria's private library, babbling happily, entirely unaware that he was the heir to a criminal dynasty. Delwyn sat on the edge of a Chesterfield leather sofa, a cup of untouched Darjeeling tea cooling in her hands. She watched Leo swat at a heavy, crystal chess piece on the low table. She felt a heavy gaze on her, and looked up. Daria was leaning against the heavy mahogany doorframe of the library. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, minus the tie, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone. He looked dangerous, devastatingly handsome, and intensely focused on her. He spent hours just watching them. He had cancelled 3 high-stakes meetings this week, delegating millions of dollars of illicit shipping deals to Silvio just to remain at the estate. "He likes the nights," Daria observed, walking into the room. He bypassed his massive desk and sat down on the floor next to Leo. Delwyn watched in silent shock as the ruthless crime boss picked up the crystal knight and handed it gently to the baby. Leo giggled, grabbing Daria's thick, scarred finger with his tiny hand. Daria's face softened, the harsh, violent lines around his eyes melting away completely. "He has Matteo's laugh," Daria said quietly, a profound sadness lacing his tone. "Loud, unapologetic. He's a good boy," Delwyn said softly. Daria looked up at her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The intensity of his stare made Delwyn's breath hitch. Over the past 7 days, the sheer terror she felt toward him had morphed into something entirely different, something infinitely more dangerous. She saw the man beneath the monster. She saw the fierce protector. "Silvio ran a background check on your old life," Daria said, his voice returning to its normal, commanding baritone as he stood up, pouring himself 2 fingers of scotch from a crystal decanter. Delwyn froze. "I have nothing to hide." "I know." Daria took a sip. "Delwyn Hughes, orphaned at 16. Put yourself through nursing school, working double shifts at a diner. Top of your class at Johns Hopkins, recruited immediately by Jackson Memorial. Spotless record. You didn't even have a parking ticket." He walked slowly toward her, stopping just inches from her knees. "And then you vanished into thin air. You became a ghost." Daria reached out, his knuckles lightly grazing her cheek. Delwyn's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, frantic rhythm. "You gave up a brilliant future to scrub my floors in secret. Why didn't you go to the FBI?" "The cartel owns half the police force in Miami," Delwyn whispered, unable to pull her eyes away from his. "Who was I supposed to trust? The men who shot Sophia were wearing tactical gear. They moved like professionals. I knew if I went to the authorities, we'd be dead before the sun came up." Daria's jaw tightened at the mention of the cartel, the Navarro cartel to be exact, the very people he had been silently at war with for a year and a half. "You did the right thing," Daria murmured, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into something fiercely possessive. "You brought him to me, but you also brought yourself." Delwyn swallowed hard. "Mr. Russo." "Daria," he corrected, his thumb tracing her jawline. "You will never call me Mr. Russo again." Before Delwyn could process the heavy implication of his words, the heavy library doors were thrown open. Silvio strode in, his face pale, a tablet clenched tightly in his hand. The romantic tension shattered instantly, replaced by the frigid air of the underworld. Daria didn't step away from Delwyn, but his entire posture shifted from a lover to a lethal weapon. "What?" Daria snapped. "We have a breach," Silvio said, his eyes darting to Delwyn and the baby, then back to his boss. "Not physical, digital." Daria stepped in front of Delwyn, shielding her from the room. "Explain." "The Russian Bratva, Nikolai's faction. They didn't like that you walked out of the Cipriani deal last week," Silvio said, his voice grim. "They paid off a low-level guard at the front gate. The guard didn't know who Delwyn and the baby were, but he leaked that you had a woman and an infant moved into the master wing. He leaked that you brought Kessler in." Delwyn gasped, pulling Leo up from the floor and clutching him tightly to her chest. Daria's eyes turned pitch black. The quiet peace of the last week evaporated, replaced by the terrifying, cold-blooded killer that ran the East Coast. "The Navarro cartel has ears in the Bratva," Silvio continued, swallowing hard. "Word is already spreading on the dark web that Daria Russo is hiding a child. They're putting the pieces together, boss. The Navarros know Matteo's body was never found with a baby. They are going to realize the bloodline survived." "Where is the guard?" Daria asked, his voice a deadly, quiet whisper. "Secured in the basement," Silvio replied. Daria turned back to Delwyn. He looked at her terrified face, at his nephew clutched in her arms. He reached out, cupping the back of Delwyn's neck, pulling her forehead against his. "Lock the estate down," Daria ordered Silvio, never taking his eyes off Delwyn. "Recall every soldier from the boroughs. Arm the perimeter. If a single leaf blows onto my property without clearance, burn it to ashes." He pulled back slightly, looking deeply into Delwyn's wide, panicked eyes. "I told you no one would ever hunt you again," Daria swore, the promise laced with impending violence. "I am going to end this war. Tonight." The transformation of the Russo estate from a luxurious, silent mansion into a militarized fortress took less than 20 minutes. The heavy iron gates at the perimeter were locked down and reinforced with spiked barricades. Dozens of black SUVs blocked the long, winding driveway, and armed soldiers from Daria's syndicate flooded the grounds, their breath pluming in the freezing night air as they took up tactical positions in the snow. Inside the basement, the air was thick with the metallic scent of fear. The traitorous guard was tied to a steel chair, his face bruised and bleeding. Daria stood over him, his knuckles raw, his eyes entirely void of humanity. "I didn't know it was the cartel," the guard wept, spitting blood onto the concrete floor. "I swear to God, boss, a Russian contact reached out. He just offered me 50 grand to confirm if you had a woman and a baby in the house. That's all I said." "You painted a target on my bloodline," Daria said, his voice a chilling, hollow rasp. He didn't yell. The terrifying calmness of his tone made Silvio, standing by the door, shiver. "You invited the monsters who slaughtered my brother into my home." Daria turned away, wiping his hands on a clean towel. He didn't even look back as he gave the order. "Silvio, take him to the harbor. He doesn't come back." As the guard's muffled screams faded up the concrete stairs, Daria checked the heavy magazine of his customized Sig Sauer MCX rifle. The Navarro cartel was not going to wait for an invitation. Alejandro Navarro, the head of the Miami faction, knew that if Daria Russo confirmed the baby's identity, the East Coast Syndicate would rain hellfire on Florida. Navarro's only move was a preemptive, overwhelming strike to finish the job they started 18 months ago. Upstairs, the master guest wing had been evacuated. Delwyn was ushered by a heavily armed security detail into the estate's subterranean panic room, a reinforced, lead-lined bunker accessible only through a hidden vault door behind the library's bookcases. The bunker was stark, brightly lit, and stocked with enough provisions and medical supplies to last weeks. But to Delwyn it felt like a tomb. She sat on the edge of a cot, clutching Leo tightly against her chest. The baby, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere and his mother's skyrocketing heart rate, whimpered softly, his small fingers digging into Delwyn's cashmere sweater. The heavy steel door hissed, and Daria stepped inside. The vault door sealed behind him with a deafening, metallic clank. He looked entirely different. The tailored suits and expensive watches were gone. He wore black tactical gear, Kevlar plating strapped tightly to his chest, and multiple spare magazines lined his belt. He looked like the ruthless king of the underworld the media painted him to be. Yet when his dark eyes landed on Delwyn, the hardened armor seemed to crack. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, dropping to one knee in front of her. He reached out, his gloved hands gently framing her face. "They are coming," Daria said, his voice remarkably gentle despite the impending bloodshed. "The perimeter sensors have picked up movement in the woods. They're trying to breach the west wall." Delwyn's breath hitched, her eyes welling with tears. "Daria, there are too many of them. The Navarros, they don't leave survivors. I saw what they did at the hospital. I saw it. They have never fought me on my own ground," Daria promised, his thumb wiping a tear from her cheek. "I built this empire to be unbreakable, and tonight I am going to bury the men who took my brother." He leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. Delwyn closed her eyes, leaning into his strength, inhaling the scent of cold winter air and gunpowder that clung to him. The terrifying reality was that in just 1 week, this ruthless, dangerous man had become her entire world. She wasn't just afraid for Leo anymore. She was entirely consumed with terror at the thought of Daria not walking back through that vault door. "Promise me," Delwyn whispered fiercely, her free hand gripping the heavy straps of his tactical vest. "Promise me you will come back to us." Daria's intense gaze locked onto hers. He leaned down, pressing a firm, lingering kiss against the top of Leo's head, and then, slowly, he brought his lips to Delwyn's. It wasn't a tentative kiss. It was a heavy, desperate seal, a promise carved in stone. Delwyn kissed him back, a sob catching in her throat as the raw, unfiltered emotion between them finally broke the surface. "I swear it," Daria murmured against her lips. "Lock the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone but me or Silvio." He pulled away, his face hardening back into a mask of lethal focus. He turned and exited the bunker. The heavy steel door locked with a mechanized groan, leaving Delwyn alone in the deafening silence. 5 minutes later, the silence was shattered. Even through 3 feet of reinforced concrete and steel, Delwyn could feel the vibrations of the assault. The muffled, heavy thuds of explosives rocking the estate's foundations made dust fall from the bunker's ceiling. Then came the relentless, staccato rhythm of automatic gunfire. The Navarro cartel had brought an army. Above ground, the Russo estate had turned into a war zone. The pristine white snow was rapidly staining crimson. Daria moved through the grand halls of his home like a shadow, leading his men with terrifying, surgical precision. The cartel sicarios, heavily armed and fueled by desperation, breached the grand foyer, shattering the antique crystal chandeliers and ripping through the priceless Renaissance paintings with a hail of bullets. "Hold the staircase!" Daria roared over the deafening gunfire, dropping 2 cartel gunmen who attempted to flank Silvio near the kitchen corridor. The firefight was brutal and intimate. The syndicate soldiers, fiercely loyal to Daria, fought with the advantage of knowing every blind corner and hidden passageway of the massive house. But the Navarros had the advantage of sheer, overwhelming numbers. As Daria reloaded his rifle behind an overturned marble dining table, a heavy explosion blew out the entire wall of the east wing. The concussive wave threw Daria backward, his head slamming violently against a stone pillar. His vision swam, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. As he fought to clear his head, he saw a squad of cartel mercenaries pouring through the breached wall, bypassing the main firefight. They weren't engaging his men. They were moving with a specific purpose, carrying heavy breaching charges. They were heading straight for the library. They knew where the vault was. "Silvio, the library!" Daria shouted, his voice tearing through his throat as he scrambled to his feet, ignoring the warm blood trickling down the side of his face. He didn't wait for his underboss. Adrenaline, fueled by pure, unadulterated panic for Delwyn and Leo, flooded his veins. Daria sprinted down the shattered, smoke-filled hallway, firing his weapon until the magazine clicked empty. He dropped the rifle, drawing the Sig Sauer from his hip without breaking stride. He burst through the splintered double doors of the library, just as the cartel squad was attaching a heavy C4 charge to the hidden vault door. There were 4 of them. Daria didn't hesitate. He became the monster the underworld feared. Moving with terrifying speed, he shot the first 2 mercenaries in the head before they even realized he was in the room. The third man spun around, his submachine gun firing wildly, tearing through Daria's shoulder. Daria didn't even flinch. The Kevlar stopped the fatal penetration, but the kinetic impact was like being hit by a sledgehammer. He fired twice, dropping the third man, But the fourth, the squad leader, tackled Daria to the floor. The gun was knocked from Daria's hand, skittering across the blood-slicked hardwood. The cartel leader, a massive, scarred man, pulled a serrated combat knife, bringing it down in a vicious arc toward Daria's throat. Daria caught the man's wrist, his muscles straining against the crushing weight. "Alejandro sends his regards," the sicario hissed, bearing down. "Tell Alejandro he's next," Daria growled. With a brutal surge of strength, Daria twisted his hips, using the man's momentum against him, flipping their positions. Daria drove his knee into the man's ribs, hearing a satisfying crack, before driving his own concealed blade directly into the cartel leader's chest. The man went limp. Daria rolled off him, his chest heaving, his shoulder burning with agonizing pain. The heavy gunfire outside was finally beginning to taper off, replaced by the shouts of Silvio and the syndicate soldiers securing the perimeter. The cartel's assault had failed. Daria dragged himself toward the vault door. He bypassed the keypad, ripping open the manual override panel with bloody fingers, and punched in the master code. Inside the bunker, Delwyn had been curled in the corner, holding Leo so tightly her arms ached, crying silently as the muffled sounds of the brutal battle echoed above. When the vault door suddenly hissed and began to swing open, she screamed, grabbing a heavy iron fire poker from the corner, ready to fight to the death to protect the baby. But as the heavy door swung wide, it wasn't a cartel soldier standing there. It was Daria. He was covered in blood, his tactical gear torn, his face bruised, and he was leaning heavily against the doorframe, breathing hard. But he was alive. "Daria!" Delwyn dropped the iron bar, running across the room. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his chest, completely disregarding the blood and the Kevlar. Daria wrapped his uninjured arm around her waist, pulling her flush against him, burying his face in her hair. He let out a long, ragged exhale, the tension of the last 18 months finally, permanently breaking. "It's over," Daria whispered hoarsely into her hair, his eyes closing. "They're gone. The Miami faction is broken. It's over." Delwyn pulled back, her medical training instantly kicking in as she noticed the dark blood seeping through the tear in his vest near his shoulder. "You're hurt. You need a doctor." "I have a nurse." Daria smiled faintly, a genuine, exhausted smile that reached his eyes. "And I have you." Dr. Kessler arrived an hour later, patching Daria up in the surviving wing of the estate. The bullet had lodged in the trauma plate, but the impact had caused a severe contusion and a deep laceration. Delwyn had refused to leave the room, holding Daria's good hand tightly as the doctor worked. The next morning, the Long Island estate was a scene of controlled chaos. Cleanup crews were scrubbing the blood from the marble, and contractors were already arriving to repair the walls. But inside the master study, the atmosphere was entirely different. Daria sat behind his heavy mahogany desk, his arm in a sling. Silvio stood before him, looking exhausted, but victorious. "The Navarro compound in Miami was raided by the FBI this morning," Silvio reported, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "Anonymous tips, complete with ledgers and offshore account numbers we conveniently leaked. Alejandro is in federal custody. The cartel is dismantled." Daria nodded slowly. "And the commission?" "The 5 families in New York are terrified, boss. They saw what happened here last night. They know you survived a full-scale assault. They're begging for a sit-down to negotiate peace." "There will be no sit-down," Daria said, his voice firm and unwavering. "Tell the commission I am stepping down." Silvio's jaw dropped. "Boss?" "What?" "You heard me," Daria said, looking out the massive window at the snow-covered grounds. "The East Coast Syndicate is yours, Silvio, if you want it. or you can dismantle it. But I am out. The shipping company, the logistics ports, the legitimate real estate, I keep those. The rest, I am walking away from. Dom, you can't just walk away from the underworld. They won't let you. Daria turned back to his oldest friend, his eyes burning with a dark, absolute certainty. They will because they know if they try to stop me, I will do to them exactly what I did to Alejandro Navarro. I am done trading in blood. As Silvio left the room, still in shock, the door to the adjoining suite opened. Delwyn walked in, holding Leo. The baby giggled, reaching his chubby arms out toward his uncle. Daria's hardened expression melted instantly. He stood up, walking around the desk, and gently took Leo with his good arm. He kissed the boy's cheek, then looked deeply into Delwyn's eyes. "I heard what you said," Delwyn murmured, her heart swelling with an overwhelming emotion. "Are you really leaving it all behind?" "Every piece of it," Daria swore, reaching out to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "I spent my whole life building an empire of fear because I thought it was the only way to survive. But you walked into a war zone with nothing but a broken locket and a promise, and you showed me what true bravery is." He stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. "I don't want to be the architect of the East anymore, Delwyn," Daria whispered, his voice thick with raw emotion. "I just want to be the man who comes home to you. I want to adopt Leo officially. I want to give him his real name back, and I want to marry you. Not to hide you, but to show the world that you are the only thing that matters to me." Tears streamed down Delwyn's face, but this time they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She didn't hesitate. She threw her arms around his neck, kissing him deeply, sealing the promise of a future she never thought she would live to see. No one breathes wrong in Daria Russo's house without consequences. But years later, the consequences weren't violence or fear. The sprawling Long Island estate, once a fortress of solitude and bloodshed, now echoed with the chaotic laughter of a 6-year-old Leo running down the pristine marble corridors, followed closely by his 2 younger adopted siblings. Daria had traded his blood-stained crown for legitimate boardrooms, fiercely protecting the peace he had bled for. Delwyn, the invisible, terrified maid who had once slept on a freezing utility room floor, stood tall as the formidable, beloved matriarch of the family. A man who had known only the cold ruthlessness of the underworld had been entirely disarmed and rebuilt by a mother's desperate love, proving that even in the darkest shadows, light can always find a way to survive.